is how I first met David, before our relationship went down the tubes and before he devoted his everything to making my life a living hell. While there are several more stories involving him, and some far more unsettling than this one, this is when I first realized he wasn't who he told me he was. It's by far the most unsettling memory I have of him. When I was young, we lived in an old farmhouse. I remember my father telling me that it was more than 100 years old, and that was the cause for the strange noises in the middle of the night. I never believed him. I was convinced that the noises were just David messing around downstairs, but in those early weeks of our friendship, no one in my family had believed it was him. I never bothered to question why. My father had inherited a 65-acre pig farm that he and his father had built from the ground up. I can't remember how many pigs we had, but it was enough to warrant 2 barns. I lived on this farm with my family, 3 older brothers and 1 younger brother, until I was 8. We moved out quite suddenly after a bad accident involving Joey, my younger brother, that left him paralyzed. I didn't understand then why my father sold his farm at the time, but I do now. We had no neighbors to speak of. To our left, you would have to go down more than 5 miles of road and cross a highway before you happened upon the next home. To the right, if you followed the large hill up and went down around the bend, eventually you would come across Mr. Carlin's house. I didn't know much about him other than he owned a cornfield that sat on the other side of the street, right across from our house, and that he always waved at me when he was on his tractor. My mother at one point had informed me that Mr. Carlin once had children and a wife, but a house fire had killed them all, and he was left alone. That was back when his house was right across the street from ours, before he planted the cornfield over it. Now it's important to note that Mr. Carlin was nearing 80 years old, and my mother told me that all this had happened when he was a very young man. I suspect a good 50 years had passed from the time the home had burned to the ground, snuffing out the lives of his family, and the summer that I met David. It was the first Monday afternoon of summer, and I was especially happy because I didn't have to go to school. And at that time, the first Monday was something of a commodity. I had taken my pink bike with red ribbons on the handlebars for a ride in the long driveway. But being the spunky 6-year-old kid I was, I'd grown tired of doing circles just outside of my house. I craved adventure, or at the very least, a chance to poke around and prod spiders at the bridge. I knew there was no chance of my mom or dad allowing me to go to the bridge by myself, but what they didn't know couldn't hurt them. My dad was off on the farm doing whatever it was that he did, but my mother was still inside, which meant that I couldn't go. Not yet, at least. I bided my time doing circles in the driveway until I watched my mom drive away, heading toward her church group. I saw my chance, and I took it. It was late afternoon, and the sun was high in the sky, beating down unforgivingly upon me. Jack, my oldest brother, was shirtless and tossing large bales of hay onto the wagon. I rode up to him, and, sweetly as I could muster, I begged for permission to go, reminding him that the bridge was still in sight and barely 50 yards from our home. Jap's lips pressed together in a thin line like they usually did when he was thinking, and his eyes narrowed and he looked back toward the barn. Dad doesn't like you going off on your own, you know that. He'll want one of us to go with you. My lower lip folded out in a pout, and I gave him the sad eyes. I had spent 3 weeks perfecting this in the mirror. I know, I said, but you're busy, and Jim is with Dad, and I don't even know where Johnny is. Please, I've been in the house all day helping Mom with cleaning. I've even scrubbed the walls, Jack. The walls. I was acting as if I had been done a great injustice when, in all reality, Mom and I scrubbed the walls once a month. Between a toddler brother and 3 older siblings, the walls were always getting a little bit filthy. But Jack didn't know that. My oldest brother's gaze fell upon me, and I looked up into his green eyes, giving him the most pathetic whimper. He looked over his shoulder one more time in search of our father, who was nowhere to be seen. I knew I had him in the palm of my hand. The thing about being one of the youngest in a house full of older guys is that they develop this weird sense to keep me safe and also happy sometimes. And sometimes that extended out to them letting me do things that I shouldn't have done. "All right, Jamie," he said, using the nickname that I despise so much. It made me sound like a baby. I wasn't a baby anymore. "But just this once, and if you get caught, don't tell Dad that I let you go, all right?" I jumped up excitedly. I yelled yes at the top of my lungs and jumped on my bike and started pedaling as fast as I could down the gravel driveway. My plan was to get the heck out of there before Jack came to his senses and realized that my dad would have murdered him for letting me go off on my own. We lived under strict rules. No one younger than Jim, at age 10, was allowed to go anywhere on their own, even if it was just down the road. My father was a strong believer in the buddy system. His worries didn't stem from an area riddled with crime, but instead the simple fact that was summer. Summer meant migrant workers, and migrant workers meant a bunch of people around Mr. Carlin's house that no one in the family knew. I managed to get my little rear end all the way down to the bridge without Jack calling me back, or Dad coming out of the barn and throwing a tantrum. Once there, I spent my few precious moments of freedom twirling thin sticks into the sticky spider webs. At the first few nudges, the spiders would get excited. They'd glide across their webs in a graceful display that I can only describe as beautiful. Their small, shiny front legs poked and prodded at the stick, and as it tried to decide what was invading its space and ruining its home. After several seconds of trying to decide what it was, the spiders would often limb off their web and explore the stick, giving me the chance to put my palm below them and wait patiently for it to descend down and tickle my skin with their tiny prodding legs. My mother was terrified of spiders. My brothers, not wanting me to inherit their debilitating fear, had taught me that they were nothing more than hairy bugs. I thought them to be endearing, which admittedly strange for a small guy like me. I was about to let my fifth spider of the day go into the weeds beside a metal post on the bridge when a small voice drew me out of my own musings. "Is that a spider?" it asked, very curiously. I stood up and turned around only to find a young boy, probably only a year or two older than myself, standing just a few feet away from me. His eyes were locked onto the spider that was now dangling from my fingertips. He gave me a toothy grin as I stared toward him. "Yep," I answered, very used to people being overly critical of a weird person who liked to mess around with spiders. "That's cool. I love bugs," he admitted. My eyes lit up. "I do too," I gushed happily. "My name is James. What's yours?" I asked, using the same old introduction they had taught me in kindergarten and first grade. "David," he answered, pronouncing the word funny. He said, "David." It took me a full minute to put it together that he was Mexican, which made sense given his dark hair and skin, something not often seen in the area that I live in. "Want to play?" I asked, handing the boy a stick. He said he did, and there we stood, shoulder to shoulder, disrupting webs and talking about the pretty designs on the back of spiders. Soon enough, we had run out of large black furred spiders to play with, but that didn't stop David, who went wandering over the other side of the bridge and found a sleek, fat spider to poke at. "Come here, James," he called, with laughter in his voice. "Look at how pretty this one is. You should hold it. I'll pretend to take pictures." I was filled with a sudden tingling sort of fear that started at the base of my spine and moved up toward my limbs. My tiny hand reached out and slapped the stick away from David's hand. "Ow," he shouted, and he was glaring at me. "You can't touch those, David," I explained, trying to keep my sudden fear and anger in check. I did what I could to explain this to him, like my father explained everything to me, calmly, quietly, and without anger or judgment. "You see that red dot on its back? If you look at its belly, it'll have a red hourglass on it. That means it's poisonous. It's a black widow," I explained. "You can't touch them. If you get bit, you could die." David only laughed, shaking his head. "Who told you that?" he asked. "Whoever it was is lying. My dad and I catch these all the time, he insisted. He spoke with such conviction and such surety that I remember thinking that perhaps I had remembered wrong. Maybe it was the spiders with the yellow dots on their backs that I shouldn't play with. I looked over to him. "Are you sure?" I asked. I waited for a nod before I picked up my stick and began the slow process of twirling it along the web. The spider had just started poking at the twig when a familiar voice called for me. I spun around, eyes on my house where Jack stood, waving his arms. "Come inside, it's time for dinner," he said. "Can I bring my friend?" I shouted back. Jack paused for a long time, eyes on David and I, before he nodded. "Sure, why not?" he asked. "I'll ask Mom to set another place." I threw the stick on the ground and abandoned the spider. I turned back to David, who for some reason or another looked a little bit angry. I brushed it off, not knowing or really caring why he might be upset. "Do you want to come inside for dinner?" I asked. David's features slowly began to melt into the same pleasant look he had worn since we had met. He gave me a nod. "Sure, thanks," he said. "Do you need to ask your mom or dad?" I asked, as I lifted my bike from the ground. David shook his head. "No, my dad won't worry unless I'm out past dark," he promised. At only 5 p.m., there was still plenty of summer sun left in the sky. Together we walked down the road and across the driveway. I left my bike in the garage, and then the two of us went inside. "Hey, Mom," I shouted as I entered the door. I pointed over to David. "This is David," I said, using his pronunciation of the word. "I met him by the bridge," I explained. "His dad won't care if he's here, as long as he's home by dark. Can he stay for dinner?" My mom turned to both of us, her eyes sparkling with amusement and happiness, probably because for the first time in forever I had brought a friend home for dinner. "Sure, he can stay," Mom answered, with a nod. "Thanks," I chirped. "Thank you, ma'am," David said with a smile on his lips, using the title that most kids use when speaking to an adult. "You're welcome," my mom said to him, just as she had grabbed up a heaping glass bowl of potatoes from the counter and walked them into the dining room. Everyone else was already sitting, expectant eyes on David and I as we walked through the threshold. Confusion washed over the faces of the other family members, while Johnny, who was only 2 years older than myself, laughed and mumbled something under his breath about me not being able to find a real friend. I looked over to David, who, to my dismay, looked entirely ashamed. I'd never been so livid in my whole life. Johnny's friends were all terribly racist, and while my mom and dad did what they could to stop the behavior, a racist comment much like this one occasionally slipped out. Johnny's friends were all terribly racist, and while my mom and dad did what they could to stop the behavior, a racist comment much like this one would occasionally slip out. I glared at him, but my father was the one to speak. "Johnny," he snapped. "That isn't nice. Apologize," he demanded. Johnny looked back at us with irritation written across his features. "Sorry," he sneered. He didn't mean the apology. That much was positively certain, but no one else bothered to tell him off, so David and I simply took our seats quietly, right beside one another. David glared at Johnny for several seconds, but Johnny made a point of completely ignoring him. "So, David, where are you from?" my mom asked. "Mexico," David answered. "My dad and I come here every year in the summer so my dad can work. Sometimes I help out too," he answered. "Oh, that's very interesting," my mother chirped before looking over to meet my eyes. "How did you and David meet?" she asked. I knew exactly where this was going, and I wasn't having any of it. "Mom, I just met him around," I insisted. My mom raised her arms in surrender. "Okay, I just asked where you met." "By the bridge," David answered. I glanced over to him with my mouth filled with my mother's famous herb and garlic mashed potatoes. David was sitting positively with his hands folded in his lap. For one reason or another, he hadn't touched his food. In fact, his eyes were still locked on Johnny, who only now seemed to even notice us. His brows furrowed in response, and his lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah, by the bridge," I answered. Once my mouth was no longer filled with potatoes, I watched slow anger rise up in my father's face, and Jack shift uncomfortably in his seat. My father opened his mouth, probably to ask why I thought it was a good idea to go out to the bridge by myself. Suddenly, I remembered the spider, and while I hadn't intended to cut him off, I also hadn't grown enough to develop the patience needed to wait for someone else to speak while something so pressing was searing into my brain. "Hey, what spiders are the black widows?" I asked. "Are they the ones with the yellow dot or the red dot?" I asked. My father's brow shot up. I watched Jack visibly relax into his seat. He tossed me a grateful look. "Red dot," my dad answered, his voice leaving no room for argument or uncertainty. I could tell in that moment that he had entirely forgotten the bridge. His mind was now on spiders and keeping me away from the more dangerous ones. "Why? Did you see one?" he asked. "Yeah, David thought we could play with it, but I told him we couldn't. I left out the part where I decided to do it anyways. I hadn't touched it after all. There was no chance it had somehow bitten and poisoned me." "You and David stay away from those," Dad said, and his eyes narrowed at the two of us. "Yes, sir," we echoed. My father didn't often look angry, so in the rare occasions like this one, I was sure to listen to him. Dinner passed rather quickly, and David and I were told to go outside, but to stay clear of the spiders. David was acting really weird that night, almost angry. I wondered if it was my dad telling us not to play with the spiders. I put the thought out of my mind and played until the sun touched the horizon, when David said he needed to go, and my mother called me inside. The next several weeks passed without incident. David started coming over almost every day, becoming a regular fixture in the house. We'd play outside. We went with Jim and Jack a few times to go fishing. We even accompanied Mom to town to go shopping. Mom was nice enough to let us both buy ice cream, but unfortunately, the moment we got outside, David dropped his, and he looked so crushed and so embarrassed about the whole thing that I quickly offered to share my own. He took me up on the offer, and my mom was sure to tell me how nice I was being. I started drawing pictures of David and I together. I was a rather talented artist at a meager 6 years of age. What I mean by this is that my stick figures both had the proper color of skin and hair, and we both were clothed. David had quickly become my best friend, and it wasn't odd for him to come over and stay from daybreak to sundown. Sometimes he'd be waiting for me outside when I woke up, and I'd run to the door, fling it open, and tell him to come in. He had always helped me with my chores, even though Mom said he didn't have to. We had been friends for nearly a full 2 months when he first breached the subject of a sleepover with me. I agreed and hastily ran inside to ask my mom and dad, who were sitting at the table discussing bills. They agreed, but on one condition, that he slept downstairs on the couch, and that he and I cleaned up after ourselves. That evening, after dinner and a few more snarky remarks from Johnny, who was good at making David feel bad about himself, we got to work making David's bed. We had made a small fort and decided that we would play in it before we went to bed. We decided that we were in the ocean. David and I were pirates looking for some buried treasure. We searched high and low, crash landing on no less than 5 islands before our fun was cut short at around 9 p.m., nearly a full hour after my normal bedtime. I fell asleep with thoughts of our adventures dancing through my mind. We'd done so much in the past 2 months. I felt so lucky to have met David. I was woken from my sleep in the middle of the night by a large crash and a howling scream. Fear, the likes of which I had never experienced before, coursed through my body, and I threw my blankets off of myself, and I joined the ranks of my parents and older siblings as we rushed down the hall. Joey, my only younger brother, could be heard crying from his bedroom. Jim was quick to rush to him. His soothing voice could be heard through the hallway as he reassured my 3-year-old brother that everything was okay. I remember Jack stopping me just as I'd hit the banister. "Whoa there, James," he said. His voice was too quiet, too calm. Everyone else sounded frantic, and someone downstairs was crying. I was terrified that David might have gotten hurt. "What's wrong?" I demanded. Jack paused, and his eyes moved back to the staircase before looking back at me. "Johnny just fell down the stairs," he said. He'll be okay. I watched him carefully. If he was okay and nothing was wrong, then why couldn't I go see? It didn't make any sense. And then one shouted sentence made everything clear. "I can see my bone," Johnny wailed from the base of the stairs. Jack winced, and my heart skipped a beat. "Liar," I hissed. "He's not okay." Tears began to well up in my eyes as Jack tried to direct me back to my bedroom, but I wasn't having any of it. I tried to push my way back toward the stairwell, but I was barely 40 pounds, standing several inches shorter than most of my peers. Jack had taken after my father. He was more than 6 feet tall and weighed at least 150 pounds. After several long seconds of squirming and struggling against his vice-like grip, I took to screaming. "I want to make sure Johnny's okay," I yelled. "What if I come with you?" a very groggy David asked me from the staircase as he walked up, dodging each of my family members as they rushed down. I looked up at Jack. "Is that okay?" I asked, wiping new tears from my eyes with the sleeves of my pajamas. "Can I go to my room with David?" Jack swiped black hair from his head and gave a nod. He leaned down and kissed my forehead. "Sure, James. Sure," he answered. David and I nodded before heading back to my bedroom. We laid down in my bed, head to foot. We talked about how Johnny's arm looked. David had seen it on his way up, and he said that the bone was jutting out of the wrist, and it looked wider than anything he had seen before. He told me that my mom had put his arm in a pink pillow that we all hated, and that she and my dad ushered him outside. We stayed up until the sunrise touched the dark sky. David talked all the while, trying to make me feel better. He assured me that Johnny would be fine and that he would be okay. He just needed a cast and probably some stitches. David had a really funny way of making me feel better. Over the course of the next few days, Johnny went on and on and on about how he had been pushed down the stairs. He blamed Jim, but he and Jack shared a room, and Jack assured him that he had been sleeping the whole time. He'd only woken seconds after Jack did. All the same, Johnny was certain it had been Jim, because he said he saw someone just a little bit shorter than himself right behind him when it happened. Despite Jim being a full 2 years older than Johnny, Jim was like me. He was short for his age, while Johnny and Jack were both giants. Johnny and Jim fought for days after that, always arguing, always shouting at each other. At one point, Johnny actually took a swing at him. Jim managed to dodge the blow, but Dad had to intervene. He took both of them to the kitchen to talk. No one was supposed to listen in when somebody got in trouble, but I was a curious kid. I decided that I needed to know what was being said. David and I stood in the long weeds that had once been the lower part of the flower garden. The beautiful bursts of violet, red, and pink had eventually taken over, and drawn out by chickweeds and dandelions. After Joey was born, my mom just didn't have the time to tend to the flowers. Our backs were against the front paneling, just below the opened window. We made no noise as we listened intently on what was being said. Dad questioned Jim over and over about what happened, but Jim insisted that he was asleep. Johnny called him a liar a few times, and eventually Jim broke down. I'd never heard Jim cry before, and it was heartbreaking. He asked over and over why no one believed him, reminding Dad that Jack had vouched for him. Dad apologized, but Jim wasn't having any of it, and he was asked to go to his room. I could tell Dad felt bad, just by the way he fell silent, like nodding his head in response. The squeak of the chair was suddenly the only sound in the kitchen. After a solid minute of silence, Johnny's voice rang out. "Someone shorter than me pushed me," he insisted. "It had to be either him or Jamie." I'd heard enough at this point. Looking back, I wish I would have paid more attention to what was being said, but as it was, I began to step away. I stopped when I caught sight of something moving in front of me. Suddenly, the world ceased to exist. Every noise except for the rush of my own blood in my eardrums faded away. I was hyper-aware of my own heartbeat, the rapid, raged breaths that torn through my chest. I've always loved the way snakes move. It was so pretty and so graceful. They have quite an elegance about them, but this snake made that dizzying and heart-pounding sort of fear creep up on me. My hands went numb, and my breath hitched, and I let out a small, distinctly feminine squeak. David looked down with a wide, genuine smile brushed across his lips. "Hey, look, it's a king snake," he said happily. "That's not a king snake," I whimpered, keeping myself as still as possible. "It's red and yellow and black. It's a coral snake. They're poisonous." My voice was tight and pinched. I felt as though I had been punched in the gut. I kept imagining it rearing up and striking, biting me down to the bone and stopping my heart with its poison. "No, it isn't," David insisted as he reached down to grab it by the back of its neck. Aside from becoming very still, it didn't react. It acted as though it hadn't even noticed David's presence. "See?" he asked. "They're nice. I catch these all the time back in Mexico. You can pick it up. It won't hurt you." I looked at him with hesitance in my eyes. He had been wrong about the spider. Why wouldn't he be wrong about this? David rolled his eyes and began to pet it with his free hand. "See? It's fine. Just pick it up. I'll keep its head steady." I should have listened to my gut. I should have walked away right then and there, but I didn't. My 6-year-old brain was insisting that if David could touch it, so could I. Slowly, as to not to scare it, I made it wiggle free of David's grasp, and I bent down, my arm outstretched. "James!" A frantic shout from my left. David and I both jumped up. The snake bolted free, heading straight toward me. I shrieked, looking from the snake to my now terrified brother. Jack grabbed the nearby shovel and sprinted toward me. Stay still, he shouted. David was halfway across the driveway. "Run," he shouted. "Run before it bites you." Had I been thinking clearly, alarms would have been going off in my head. If it was a king snake, and if David knew this, then why did I have to run if he was telling me to now? But I wasn't thinking rationally, and I was caught in the moment. My heart was in my throat. My hands were clammy and shaking. I felt like I was going to puke. Jack was too far away to help. The snake rose up on its belly, bobbing back and forth as most snakes do before they strike. "Run," came David's command again. I did. I got 2 steps away when I felt something hit the back of my shoe. I let out a howl of terror. Before the snake had a chance to strike a second time, Jack's shovel buried its head into the ground. The snake's body twisted and struggled beneath the heavy metal. Its tail whipped the ground beneath it and flattened out chickweed. Jack stomped on the metal part of the shovel over and over, causing the crunch of breaking bones to echo into the silence. The familiar sound of the screen door slamming caused me to jump, and I spun around to see the front of my house. My dad rounded the corner, trailed by my mother, both demanding what the noise was about. Jack lifted the shovel and hit the snake a few times just to be certain before he scooped up the corpse to show my father. "Dummy nearly got herself killed. She tried to pick the thing up," he answered. All the color leaked from my parents' faces as they stared down at the 3-foot behemoth. "James," my mother shouted, with her eyes alive with fear as she started to stare over to David and I, "you know what a coral snake looks like." My bottom lip quivered and tears spilled down my cheeks. "I thought it was a king snake," I insisted. "I really did." "James, we don't have king snakes around here," my father explained. The fear had been replaced by a quiet sort of anger. I knew I was in for it, and as shameful as it was to admit, I didn't want to go down alone. "David told me it was," I shouted. David's eyes widened, and he glared death at me as I confessed to everything. "He told me it was a king snake. He told me to pick it up, and he told me to run." "Enough," my dad shouted. "If David is going to get you hurt, then he can't come here anymore." It was the sort of angry shouting that seemed to shake the whole world. I'd never heard my father yell before. To say I was terrified is an understatement. "You hear that, David?" my father asked, glaring daggers at the two of us. "You aren't welcome here anymore." David grabbed my hand with tears in his eyes. He pulled me toward the end of the driveway. "Let's go," he shouted. I tried to stop, but David was strong, so much stronger than I remembered him being. He pulled me across the gravel, forcing me to go. "Get your butt back here, James," my father roared. He had never sworn before that point, and then all of a sudden he did. Suddenly, I stopped struggling and began sprinting right beside David. I'd never been spanked, not even once, but I knew from the stories that Jack had told me about when he was little that was what was going to happen. "Where are we going?" I asked, as our shoes bounced against the pavement of the road. My heart was clawing at my chest, begging to be freed. My whole body thrummed with excitement and fear, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Tears streamed down my face. "Into the cornfield," David shouted. "We'll go find my dad. He won't let your dad hurt us," he promised. Looking back now, I know that under normal circumstances, I would never have run from my father. I'd never been abused, and I had no reason to fear him, but in that moment, I was terrified. Heavy footsteps exploded from behind us, but I never looked back. I slipped into the cornfield behind David. We dodged stalks of corn, running this way and that, trying to put as much distance between us and the footfalls as we could. I shrieked when something grabbed my shoulder. Whoever it was forced me to stop. David continued to pull at my arm, and it felt as though I was going to be ripped apart. I howled in agony, and my limbs widely swinging as I tried to prevent myself from being stolen away from my best friend and the promised safety of his father. "Holy hell," Jack breathed. It was with those words that the sudden clarity settled over me. Something was very wrong. Jack didn't swear, and my father forbade it. Jack's arms suddenly wrapped around my waist. "Holy hell," he repeated. Dread filled my small body. Jack wouldn't have sworn unless something was terribly wrong. I stopped thrashing and I looked up to Jack. I'll never forget what I saw in that moment. Jack's eyes were wide with fear, and his mouth was agape, and his hands were shaking. I'd never seen my older brother afraid of anything. In my eyes, Jack was as superhuman and invincible as my father. They were both massive men, more than 6 feet tall, both rippling with muscles, both with beards and calloused hands. Something had frightened Jack, and as far as I was concerned, if it was enough to frighten him, we were all in trouble. I scanned the field around us, but saw absolutely nothing. My eyes landed on David, who must have seen the same thing that Jack did, because he let me go and ran away. "No," I shouted. "David, come back." Then Jack clamped his hand over my mouth and stopped my urgent cries. If there was something in that cornfield with us, David shouldn't have gone off alone. I considered biting Jack's hand just so I could call out to my friend, but just as I managed to get a small piece of flesh between my teeth, Jack began to swear again. "Crap," he squeaked, tightening his grip on me. The absolute fear in his voice stopped me from my endeavor. I wanted to ask what was wrong, but his hand was still firmly clamped around my mouth. "Dad," he shouted as he sprinted toward the road. "What? Did you find her?" my father shouted. I was being jostled back and forth, the motion of it all making me sick to my stomach. I tried to reach the ground so I could run beside Jack instead of being carried, but Jack pressed me against his chest, my feet dangling helplessly above the dirt. "Dad," he yelled again. "Dad." His voice broke, and I looked up. A fresh wave of nausea washed over me when I realized he was crying. "Dad." My dad's voice became frantic as the two of them searched for one another. We finally broke free from the cornfield just as my father took a step in. "Don't go in there," Jack shouted, tears streaming down his face. My dad's face paled for the second time that morning. I don't think he had ever seen his adult son cry. My mother was in a panic behind him, demanding to know what had happened. Jack shouted again that Dad didn't need to go into the cornfield. My father eventually stepped away, humoring my brother, and my parents flanked him as we all sprinted back toward the house. Jack practically dropped me into the kitchen floor, but I didn't really notice. I was too busy watching him cry and shake and try to stutter out things that just weren't making sense. Eventually, my oldest brother, that I'd come to think more of as a God, then a man collapsed onto the ground. He cried into himself, curled up like a ball, like a scorned toddler. That image is forever burned into my brain. The utter helplessness that radiated off of him, the agony that was etched into his features. It's maddening to think of even now. After what felt like hours of my brother sobbing on the ground, my mother rubbing his back, and the cooling soft words he composed himself enough to speak. "Look at his arm. Look at his arm," he shouted. His hand shot out to grab my own, and he pulled me toward himself. My father stepped toward us. I shrank away, unsure of what to expect from him, but the look of worry in his eyes quelled any fears of physical punishment that I had. "What happened?" he asked, staring down at the hand-printed shaped bruise that David had left on my arm. I hadn't noticed that until that moment. Once pointed out to me, I remember feeling more confused than frightened or angry. I eyed it cautiously and curiously. I'd never been bruised so easily before. What's more, I had never gotten a bruise that large before. "James?" my dad asked, cupping my chin in his hand, as he forced my head up and stared down at me with green eyes. "What happened?" he asked. I gazed back at him dumbfounded. Why was he concerned with a bruise? Odd as it may have been, it wasn't important. Jack and David had seen something terrible in the cornfield. Why weren't they storming outside with guns in their hands? Why weren't they shooting at whatever had my brother so frightened? Mountain lions were prevalent in the area, and I assumed that he had seen one of them stalking us. Or perhaps he had seen a raccoon wobbling with the telltale signs of rabies. My dad had shot one of those once in the backyard. My mother had cried for hours afterward. It seemed logical that if it brought tears to her, it would do the same to Jack. Despite the utter confusion that plagued my young mind, I answered him. I just assumed we'd get to whatever it was that happened as soon as he knew I was okay. David tried to pull me. I had intended to tell him the whole story about how David and Jack had treated me like a rag doll and played a quick game of tug-of-war before whatever it was that was in the cornfield had scared him away. "No, James, tell me what really happened," my father shouted, and I jumped, pulling my arm back, not really understanding why I was in trouble. "That is what happened," Jack said with a distant voice. He sounded distraught, broken, and a little angry. "What do you mean, that is what happened?" my father demanded. My mind was spinning. Why were they talking about David? Why did anyone care about what had happened between me and David? Why was this what we were talking about? "I mean what I said," Jack shouted, burying his face in his hands. I jumped, letting out a small squeak as I put a few feet between myself and a cluster of my family members. No one yelled at Dad. No one was that suicidal. But Dad didn't get angry. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten to kick Jack out. Instead, his features crumbled and he looked back at me. "James, tell me what happened," he said. There was something about his voice that made my stomach hurt again. "I just told you," Jack shouted, standing up suddenly from his place on the kitchen floor. He stabbed a hand at the refrigerator to the picture of David and I holding hands. My heart leapt as Jack swore again. But as my eyes went over to my father, I realized he wasn't angry. He acted as though he hadn't even heard the word. His features were pale, and his hands shook at his sides. Skinny kid, brown skin, black hair, jeans, red shirt. It was in that moment that something struck me. I'd never thought much about it before, but the way Jack shouted about David's clothes made me realize that I'd never seen him outside of the red t-shirt and dirty jeans. And Jack's voice drew thoughts out of me. But his voice broke again, and he buried his hands in his face again. "What?" my other asked. "Jack, what?" Jack looked up to them. His face was white as a sheet, and tears stained his cheeks and ran into his beard. His voice trembled as he answered, "He didn't have any eyes."